Alfred's dad was halfway down the basement stairs, still joking about digging out some old wrestling tapes for us to watch. That's when it hit me. Wrestling tape 2 was still sitting inside the VCR. I never took it out, I never rewound it, and I never told Alfred what was actually on it. A woman I had only recently started dating kept asking me almost every day to sleep at her house. I had just come out of a relationship that lasted almost a decade, and I had no idea how to date as an adult, so I assumed she wanted things to move faster. She even told me I could take the couch if it made me more comfortable. I turned her down more than once before I finally asked why it mattered so much to her. Her name was Josefina, but she went by Jojo. We had both come out of long relationships not long before we met, and we agreed early on to take things slowly. That was exactly why the sleepover felt like such a big step to me. When I pushed her on why she wanted me there so badly, something in her expression changed. She looked almost ashamed, as though she did not want to say it aloud. So why was she so desperate to have someone in that house with her? She finally told me. For the past few weeks, she said, she had been waking during the night and seeing something. A shape standing in the corner of her bedroom, human-shaped. At first, she assumed it was shadows playing tricks on her, the way a dark room sometimes can. But then it started appearing in the doorway while she slept on the couch. After she tried leaving the light on to stop it, it appeared inside her closet instead. The night before she told me all of this, she had thrown a stuffed animal at it, and she swore it struck something solid. I am not proud of how I reacted. I have a habit of turning serious moments into jokes when I do not know what else to do, and this was exactly the wrong time for it. I made a comment about the monster under her bed. She became more upset, not less. I backpedaled and suggested sleep paralysis, then furniture casting strange shadows, and finally the possibility that she was so exhausted that her mind was filling in the gaps. I genuinely believed there had to be a normal explanation. Partly out of guilt for the joke, I agreed to stay over that night. By around 8 that evening, we were on the couch with a movie playing, and Jojo was fading fast. I remember thinking how exhausted she looked, and it only made me more confident that lack of sleep explained everything happening in that house. I sat beside her while she slept, and at some point, I dozed off too, still sitting upright. She woke me in the dark. She did not say anything at first. She only pointed toward the doorway on the far side of the room. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. Then I saw it, a shape standing there, completely still. I called out toward it and received no answer. Jojo grabbed my arm before I could stand and begged me to stay where I was. I decided I needed proof, one way or another. There was a throw pillow beside me on the couch, and my reasoning was simple. If it was only a shadow, the pillow would pass through it. Jojo had already tried something similar the night before, and she did not want it to happen again. I threw it anyway. It did not pass through the doorway. I heard a thud, watched the pillow fall straight to the floor, and then saw the shape move backward into the room behind it. That was the moment my skepticism disappeared. I stood up. Jojo was screaming at me to return to the couch, but I was already walking toward the doorway. Before I reached it, I heard whispering, low, indistinct, and coming from inside the dark room. I could not understand a single word. As I tried to step through, the door swung shut in front of me and knocked me backward. When I tried the handle, it was locked. From the other side, I could hear objects falling and shifting, as though something was moving violently around the room. Then, without warning, everything became silent. I had one of those small lock-picking tools on my keychain, and it worked. Inside the room, which Jojo used as a home office, looked as though it had been hit by a small tornado. Books and papers were scattered everywhere, and furniture had been knocked out of place. The window was wide open. There was no screen covering it, and there was nothing else inside the room. No shape, no figure, nothing. I suggested calling the police. Jojo did not believe it would help because, as far as she was concerned, this was not something the police could deal with. We never made the call. Instead, we cleaned the room together, and she stayed at my apartment for a few nights afterward. When we finally returned to her house, I stayed over again, and nothing happened. Eventually, she began sleeping there alone, and the sightings stopped. 5 years later, we are engaged. We still disagree about that night. She is convinced it was something paranormal. I have never been able to ignore the open window or the possibility of what a person might have done with it. I have thought about it more than I probably should. Which would actually be worse? A shadow standing in your doorway, or a person who found a way inside and stood there watching you sleep? I never found an answer. The open window explanation feels more ordinary, but it does not explain the locked door, the whispering, or the sounds from inside the office. The supernatural explanation creates even more questions. All I know is that after that night, it never happened again. Jojo had wanted someone else to see what she had been seeing for weeks. In the next account, two friends saw the same stranger clearly, more than once, and neither of them could explain how she knew the names she used. At 1:13 in the morning, the doorbell rang for the second night in a row. This time, someone was standing outside. I was 18, and it had taken weeks of convincing before my parents agreed to leave me home for an entire weekend. The condition was that my closest friend, Evan, would stay with me the whole time. Our plan was pizza and video games. Nothing more exciting than that. Both of us came from strict households, so this was not some secret party setup. It was simply two sheltered teenagers getting a rare taste of independence. We ordered pizza and wings, and spent Friday night playing Kingdom Hearts. For the first time in a long time, I felt as though my parents actually trusted me, and I was not going to do anything that might change that. Late that night, the doorbell rang. Hearing it when you are not expecting anyone creates a strange kind of fear. Your body reacts before your mind has time to decide whether anything is wrong. Evan wanted to ignore it. I nearly agreed until it rang a second time, then a third. By that point, somebody had to be standing outside and ringing deliberately. I opened the main door, leaving the screen door locked in front of me, and looked out. Nobody was there. I searched the street in both directions, but did not see anyone walking away, any vehicle pulling off, or anything moving near the property. There was only an empty porch and an empty street. We convinced ourselves that it was a prank, or someone at the wrong address who had left before I opened the door. We did not sleep well that night, but by the following afternoon, we had almost forgotten about it. Then, at around 1:13 on Saturday morning, the doorbell rang again. This time, someone was standing behind the screen. An elderly woman. She was short, white-haired, and wrinkled, wearing a long coat even though it had to be close to 70 degrees outside. She had a scarf tied around her hair, and she was smiling at me. She asked whether Mr. Walker was home. I told her that nobody by that name lived there. Her expression barely changed, as though she already knew that, as though she was only confirming it aloud. Then she asked about someone named Joe. I told her again that she had the wrong house, and I asked her to leave. She laughed. She said Joe was still inside. When I asked what she meant, she said she could hear him. I closed the door and told Evan to be ready to call the police if she refused to leave. Through the front window a few minutes later, we could see her standing in the middle of the street, facing our house. It was dark and difficult to make out the details, but I was fairly sure she was still smiling. We discussed calling the police, but we hesitated. We were two sheltered teenagers who were unsure what kind of trouble the call might create. Looking back as an adult, I would have called the moment she appeared. By 3 in the morning, she was still outside. I had waited long enough. I decided I would open the main door, leave the screen door locked, and order her to leave or tell her I was calling the police. The moment I opened it, she sprinted toward the house. For an elderly woman, she moved much faster than I expected. I slammed the door and screamed. Evan grabbed my attention and pointed toward the window beside it. She was standing at the window, looking through the glass. She was close enough for me to see her clearly. Her body was bent sideways at an angle that looked wrong for someone her age, and she was still smiling. Completely still. I called the police. She left before the patrol car arrived. I could tell the officer did not fully believe our description. I did not blame him. Two teenagers were claiming that an elderly woman had stood outside for hours, run toward the house, and then watched them through a window. He listened to our account, took our statements, and left. We remained awake for the rest of the night. She never returned. Not that night or at any point afterward, as far as I know. When my parents came home on Monday morning, I eventually told them everything, including the fact that I had called the police. As I repeated the names the woman had used, their expressions changed completely. They stopped asking what she looked like. They told me something about the house that they had apparently decided I never needed to know. When I was 5, they bought it at a reduced price. According to them, the reason it was so cheap was that a man named Joe had killed his wife there and then himself. That explained one name. The other did not come from this house at all. It came from the home we had lived in before it, when I was too young to remember what had happened. A man who called himself Mr. Walker had allegedly stalked our family at that address for months. He called at all hours, threatened my father, appeared at the house, and tried the doors and windows. One night, he reportedly broke in while my father was waiting with a rifle. My father said he fired at him in the dark but never knew whether the shot struck him. Mr. Walker ran and was never seen again. We moved a few weeks later, and that was when my parents became as strict as they were for the rest of my childhood. I had no way to verify either story beyond what my parents told me that morning. Until then, I had never known that either man existed. What still disturbs me is not how quickly she moved or the angle at which she stood beside the window. It is that out of every name a stranger could have chosen at random, at our door in the middle of the night, she used the exact two my parents least wanted to hear. Before we get to the final account, be honest with yourself. After that first night of ringing, would you have opened the door a second time? The woman at the window somehow knew names the narrator's family had buried. The final account hides its secret somewhere just as ordinary, inside a basement full of videotapes. Out of hundreds of carefully labeled wrestling tapes, only a few had no event name or date. One of them was marked Wrestling Tape 2. For most of my life, I considered what happened a strange memory rather than a frightening one. Only recently, now that I am older, have I stopped focusing entirely on the tape and started thinking more about how Alfred acted before his family disappeared from our lives. I was in 5th grade, so I was probably around 10. Alfred transferred into our class partway through the year, which was already a difficult position for any child. Some of my friends made fun of his name until they shortened it into something crueler, and it stuck. It did not seem to bother him outwardly, but I always had a soft spot for him, mostly because his family had moved into the house directly next door to mine. We rode the same bus, walked the same route home, and during those walks, we discovered that we both loved professional wrestling, something none of my other friends could stand. One afternoon, my mother finished a call with Alfred's mother, who had apparently said that Alfred was struggling to make friends and that things seemed easier when he was around me. She asked whether I could stay at their house that night. I was not thrilled. My friends would have made fun of me if they found out, but my mother had already agreed before I had any say in the decision. The evening was better than I expected. His parents were warm and welcoming. His father wore an old wrestling shirt, performed impressions, and clearly enjoyed discussing the sport as much as we did. Before going upstairs to bed, his parents told us we could stay awake as long as we wanted, provided we remained quiet and stayed out of the basement. Alfred explained that his father stored dangerous work equipment downstairs. I never slept well in unfamiliar houses, and that night was no exception. I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar noises of someone else's home. At some point, I heard Alfred's father come downstairs. I pretended to be asleep. His footsteps moved toward the basement. A door opened and closed in the hallway, and a few seconds later, muffled, static-heavy audio began drifting through a vent near my head. It sounded like an old television playing something, but the sound was too distorted for me to understand any words. It continued for close to an hour before stopping. Then I heard him return upstairs. The next morning, during breakfast, he mentioned his large collection of old wrestling tapes and called himself a tape trader, someone who exchanged rare recordings with other collectors. That seemed to explain the sound completely. He offered to find a few recordings for us to watch later, and my mother agreed to let me stay another night. When I mentioned to Alfred that I had heard his father in the basement, he looked genuinely confused, as though he had no idea his father ever went downstairs during the night. I suggested that we look at the tape collection ourselves before his father returned. Alfred did not want to. He said we should not enter the basement without his father. I continued pushing, and he eventually agreed. I think he did not want to risk losing the only new friendship he had managed to make. The basement was ordinary at first. Cold, dark, and unfinished. Exactly the kind of half-used space you might expect beneath an older house. At the back stood a yellow wooden door with "Get Out" spray painted across it. Alfred said it was already that way when they moved in, and that his father thought it was funny enough to leave untouched. Behind it was a wall of shelves filled with videotapes. Every tape was carefully labeled with a wrestling event and a year. Event name, date, year. Only a few were different. They were labeled with names such as Wrestling Tape 1 and Wrestling Tape 2. No event, no date. No other information. I selected the one marked Wrestling Tape 2 and inserted it into the VCR. What appeared was not wrestling. It was grainy footage of a room that was entirely red. The walls, floor, and ceiling were the same color, with a single wooden chair in the center of the frame. Nothing moved on the screen, but screaming could be heard faintly in the background. After a moment, a man wearing a mask entered the frame and said, in a strangely cheerful voice, that the viewer would want to stay tuned for what happened next. He laughed while the screaming continued. That was when Alfred noticed a car outside. We switched off the television and ran upstairs. His father entered acting exactly as friendly and relaxed as before. He told us to give him a few minutes to find some matches for us, and then he went into the basement. It was only after he had started downstairs that I remembered the tape was still inside the VCR. I had not rewound it. I had not returned it to the shelf, and I had not told Alfred any of that. About an hour passed before his father came upstairs. His friendliness was gone. He told me, flatly, that I needed to go home, and then he walked away without explaining why. Nothing he said confirmed that he found the tape, but I always believed that he did. Alfred was not at school on Monday. When I returned home, I went next door to check on him. He answered looking as though he had been crying. He told me that his family was moving because his father had received a new job. When I asked whether he was okay, there was a long pause before he said that he was. His father appeared behind him in the hallway, and Alfred said he had to leave before closing the door. By the following day, the family had moved out. Our teacher made a brief announcement that Alfred would not be returning, and the class moved on quickly. At 10 years old, I did not understand how unusual the timing might have been. It was years later, while telling the story to a group of friends, that someone mentioned the idea of red rooms, a piece of dark web folklore I had never heard about before that conversation. My first reaction was to reject it. The footage was on VHS, and there was no way to know whether the screaming was real. Nothing on the screen showed any actual violence. I want to be clear that the theory was never confirmed. The tape may have been staged. It may have been a low-budget horror recording or something Alfred's father received while trading tapes. His anger might only have been about two children entering a basement they had been explicitly told to avoid. The move may genuinely have been connected to a new job. The timing may have been a coincidence, but certain questions remained. Why were only a few tapes labeled so vaguely? What was playing through the vent the previous night? Who recorded the footage? Did Alfred's father know exactly which tape we had played, or only that we had entered the room? Why did Alfred appear to have been crying the last time I saw him? And had the move already been planned before any of this happened? I was a child. I did not understand what I was looking at, and I did not know whether Alfred was simply upset about moving or frightened by something else. I hope it really was nothing more than a low-budget horror recording that happened to be sitting on the wrong shelf. What remains with me is not the tape itself. It is not knowing whether Alfred needed help and realizing that by the time I began asking the right questions, there was no one left to answer them. None of these three accounts comes with enough evidence to say with certainty what happened, but they share one thing in common. Every warning had an ordinary explanation attached to it, right up until someone decided to look a little closer.